Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining me for what is actually a spontaneous video. I just fancied making a video about God's existence, and I wanted to think of the best arguments and reasons I could come up with for God's existence. And to make it unique and interesting, I wanted to say that what would those arguments look like if we took it as seriously as we could, if we got our science right, if we didn't come up with any bogus arguments, because there are a lot of good and bad arguments for the existence of God. None of them are compelling because clearly we haven't done a very good job of trying to resolve it with arguments alone. And the fact that these conversations keep happening show that there's a lot of open-endedness to those arguments. So I've come up with 4 good reasons why I think God exists, and I think they are reasons that one might come up with if the conversation and the subject was given the full gravitas and consideration and depth of thinking that I think it deserves. And my 4 are 3 of which are about God's existence in terms of what we might come up with before we decided which religion was the correct one, if any. And the 4th one is going into more detail about if we can have a justified belief in God, then what might we do with that? So 4 has a few subset points, but the first argument for God that I'm going to propose is one that takes us right back to the beginning, because we need to ask this question first and foremost before we even talk about anything else in the religious sense, and that is to do with what's called aseity, which is the existence of something that would be a contradiction if it didn't exist. It would undermine the fabric of reality by not existing. Now, this is something that I talk about as bootstrapping existence, if you like. And you know, the fact that anything exists at all is a very intriguing and complex question. Never mind the fact that it's the universe, just existence itself of any kind. So the first good argument for God I'm going to talk about is to do with the nature of mathematics. Now, everything physical that exists is made of mathematics. Physical things, you know, they may be made of other dimensions that we don't have the capacity to perceive or understand. There may well be, and probably are, spiritual elements, even at the first level of our inquiry, but that they are made of mathematics is so incontrovertible it barely needs a defense. You know, for a thing to exist, it must have properties, and if propositions about those things are either true or false, independent of human construction, then not only do those objects exist, they exist in a more primary way than anything physical exists. It's quite a lot to get your head around, but it's the reason we perceive the world in terms of water and soil and rocks and trees and sand and that sort of thing is because the human cognitive sensory apparatus interfaces with the world physically, because we are physical beings. And the remarkable thing about reality is if you removed our sensory perceptions from the equation and every other sensory perception, then what you're left with is the discrete properties of physics, which is governed by mathematics. But without physics, we're left with mathematics. But as I say in my book, mathematics is the territory, and physics is merely a map that's being used to explore the terrain of the territory. And that's quite counterintuitive, and people, I think, are a bit surprised by that. But because they assume often that physics is the territory, and that the mathematics is merely something we've created to understand and interface with the territory of physics. But it's not. It's the other way around. Mathematics is more primary than physics. Everything physical is a mathematical object, and the systems that emerge from the properties of mathematics are infinitely complex, and way more complex than anything that exists physically. Even something like our universe is a comparably small mathematical object compared with the nature of mathematics and all of its potential. There's no, the simplest thing we can describe is something which contains a single bit of information. One bit of information. That's simplicity at its rawest. But there's no upper level of complexity to mathematics. It just keeps going on to be infinitely more and more complex. So mathematics has a better chance of being the candidate for aseity than physics does, because there's nothing contradictory about the idea of physics not existing, but it's difficult to conceive of a reality where mathematics doesn't exist. And the philosophical question, why is there something rather than nothing, which is often postulated, it really shouldn't just mean why does our universe exist at all, or why do universes exist at all, as it so often is taken to mean. It really should mean, why isn't it the case that absolutely nothing exists at all? The existence of the universe or multiple universes is an absolutely astonishing thing to ponder it in itself. But even that doesn't get us close to why whatever exists to explain our interpretation of existence exists at all. That's something you can sit and spend hours in solitude contemplating, as I have. It's a remarkable, mind-blowing thing that we have existence at all. And if we start with the two most certain things that we can sense, it's that existence is, because we know at least something exists, and within existence there is thinking going on. And this is where it gets even more interesting, because explaining mathematics is not something that anyone can just trivialize and say, well, it just happens to exist. No, that's not good enough. And the thing you'll also notice about mathematics perhaps is that mathematics doesn't have any sense of properties or existence unless there's an up and running sentience, unless there's an up and running mind to interface with and conceive and to engage with the properties. So, in other words, mathematics doesn't seem to have, even though it's the territory under which the map of physics lays, it still doesn't have enough necessary complexity to explain itself as a creative entity by itself. And that's where we get to the idea that God's mind is the best candidate we know and can conceive for the aseity of existence, for why something exists at all. Existence and mind are the two primary tenets to reality. They're the two primary truths that can be asserted with absolute certainty and even without any unsubstantiated claims. Existence is, there is thinking going on. And it's from those two truths that all other tenets of reality extend into possibility. If existence and mind are the two things about which we are most certain, then it's not unreasonable to lay claim to the idea that those are the two primary properties that bootstrap not just our belief in God, but the necessity of God's existence. I don't think that alone is sufficient to say that God certainly exists. But at the very least, we might say that the idea that God might be behind the primary tenets of reality is more reasonable. It's more of a reasonable proposition than the alternatives. I mean, you've seen where atheism and skepticism has taken us. The current proposition from atheists at the minute is that, well, absolutely nothing created the universe. Well, yes, scientists will say, well, that's not our final word either. But the reason they're in such a difficulty is because the notion of nothing is a bogus term. There is no such thing as nothing. There's never been nothing where nothing means nothing at all, in contrast to existence is. And once you understand that, it becomes clear that the best argument for existence is that we have a God. And I know people will say, well, then what created God? But that's not good enough, because it betrays the kind of language we're using when we talk about this, because created God takes us back to our physical sense of cause and effect and before and after and time, which is a physical property known as space-time. So that's reason number one. It's not enough to convince on its own that God exists, but it's a jolly good argument for God's existence, and it's certainly better than anybody's ever come up with to explain away existence and truth and mind aside from that. Now, part two, the second reason. Having established that God is very likely behind the universe, we'd expect to see something in the universe, or many things in the universe perhaps, but certainly something that would exhibit his genius. Just like an ingenious painter would want to exhibit his or her work, or a storyteller would want to produce a book. What is it about the universe that we live in that shows God's hand, that shows his creative dispensation? And we do have such a thing. This is the second reason why we can know that God exists. So this will take some unpacking, but it's true of the universe. It doesn't make any fallacious scientific statements. It's consistent with all of the known science of the universe. But the truth is, when it comes to the universe itself, we have what's called a biased random walk. Now, I'll explain how that works and what that is in a second, but there's been a lot of bad arguments made about the whole notion of fine tuning, and a lot of them aren't very reliable. They're not very convincing. They're not very seductive. But this isn't quite that. But it's something that about the mathematics of the universe that shows God has severely interfered with the process of creation to show that it's him governing the mathematics. So at the point of the Big Bang, the visible universe was maximally ordered, and ever since that, it's tended more and more towards disorder. This is basic physics, which means it tends towards a state of no thermodynamic free energy. It's called a heat death, basically, to an ultimate state of thermodynamic equilibrium, which means that the processes that enable any pockets of increased entropy will have reached a minima, and everything will be a kind of banal soup stagnating at just above absolute zero. You know, the laws of physics confirm this about the physical nature of the universe, and the mathematical patterns should be concomitant with those laws, but they're not quite. Even though the laws of physics express mathematical patterns that confirm the heat death, because all of physics can confirm this is an inevitable trajectory of the universe, the mathematics, once it's observed carefully, shows some deliberate tinkering. It's like a mathematical skew in the tending towards maximum entropy, which goes against how the universe was set up after the Big Bang. Now, obviously, this is not the same argument that some creationists make about the second law of thermodynamics disproving evolution. That's something entirely different, and I will do a talk on that soon. So let's try and break it down more simply. So that was a very technical explanation, but we know the universe is expanding, and that expansion is part of a universal principle known for maximum order of the Big Bang, which is zero entropy, to greater and greater disorder as expansion increases. So maximum entropy is everything we should expect from an expanding universe with the laws we are observing. Yet, against all odds, we have clumps of order with lower entropy. Now, I know there'll be a good reason to explain that away with both a theistic reason and an atheistic reason, but both of them potentially miss the deeper point here. What's astonishing is that the only time in the history of the universe that we should expect to see the sort of low entropy we see in systems like life, or even planets and stars, is at the point of the Big Bang. This is what the laws of our universe tell us. There are good reasons for this. You know, it's fundamentally what the mathematics of the universe tells us. After the initial expansion, every instance within space-time should be more and more disordered. You know, it took 200 million years or so before the first clumps of order capable of producing stars came about. We are here to testify that the laws towards maximum disorder have not been just let go in a way that a naturalistic interpretation might suggest. You know, despite an increased acceleration towards disorder, there are huge mathematical constraints on the universe that interject in its fundamental laws. Now, remember, we're talking about mathematical interjection, a mathematical skew here, not necessarily something that's very easily observed in the physical universe itself, because remember, the physical universe is a bit like reading a map after observing the territory. It's just that we're not very good at observing the territory because it's complex, and this is complex stuff to get our heads around. So after the cosmic period of inflation, when the universe was just a fraction of a second old, in physical terms, it was expanding faster than the speed of light. You know, during that time, I think it doubled in size, somewhere between 90 and 100 times in a fraction of a second. You know, we're talking about something pretty remarkable here. So now try to imagine the rate of inflated expansion the universe was undergoing in just the first few hundred years, never mind the first few million. Yeah, as I said, it took another 200, 300 million years before something as old as a star came along. What we know at the base level is that the universe is about 14 billion years old, that it's been evolving physically and then eventually biologically to produce all the creatures on this planet. what's clear is that if the universe were to play out with its known laws, its known physical laws and procedures in an unguided fashion, 14 billion years, although it sounds a long time, it's nowhere near enough time to generate the kind of created, ordered complexity in the physical regime required to produce complex things like biological life. It sounds a long time, but it's deceiving. We can be practically certain that that's true, which is why I've been inviting you to think of this cosmic story in a different way. Some people have been tempted to say that, in a universe with 200 billion stars, and in our galaxy and 2 trillion galaxies in the universe, they'll say, yeah, a planet with life like ours was bound to come along somewhere. But it's the wrong way to think about it. Yes, 200 billion stars and 2 trillion galaxies are staggering numbers. And therefore, surely, once such astronomically large numbers are plugged into the equation within such a huge search space of possibilities, we're bound to find life on at least some of the planets. They'll say, including, as it turns out, our own. But it's a dubious argument. Even in a universe of 200 billion stars and 2 trillion galaxies, the logarithmic consideration of those numbers puts them into a perspective which shows they are relatively small numbers. They're highly likely to be insufficient to ensure the creation of life of evolution by itself. Calculating logarithms, it basically means working out the exponent to which a base must be raised to arrive at a given number. Now, if you think about what I said at the beginning, that the universe was maximally ordered at the point of the Big Bang. So imagine what they call a combinatorial search space of every possible configuration of microstates, say, of a system of particles in the universe in the point of the Big Bang. We're going to find that this search space is immeasurably huge. It's a number of possible microstates larger than you could write down in your entire lifetime. It's going to be trillions and trillions of digits in length. It goes without saying that the combinatorial search space is going to be immeasurably larger than our observable universe, just as the possible arrangements of playing cards in a deck is going to be astronomically larger than the number of playing cards in the box. Relative to the size of the search space, the size and scope of the universe is minuscule in terms of scope for producing order from the results of a random set of computations. Now, I say random because even if from the point of the Big Bang, the universe was maximally random, then even that would be something strange, because to be maximally random is quite a strange and peculiar phenomenon in itself. So if we're asking the universe to produce the ordered complexity to provide the substrate on which something like biological evolution can run billions of years down the line, we'd find that the given size of our universe, or given the size of our universe, the number of opportunities for that sort of order to form by chance is way too meager, despite the impressive number of stars and galaxies. Or to put it the other way around, a universe of our size and scope would not be able to produce the substrate on which biological evolution can run without a huge, highly contingent combinatorial constraint imposed at the beginning when the laws of physics were created. Now, that is not special pleading. That is not a fine-tuning argument. Not really. It's not. It betrays none of the established science that we understand. It's just a fact that the mathematical engine that governs the laws of physics and the accelerated expansion has been constrained by what's called a bias, or what I've called a biased random walk. A random walk is a model which looks at a drunkard coming out of a pub. Whether he takes a step to the left or a step to the right is entirely random. So where he ends up after 100 steps is entirely random. And if you apply that random walk model to the universe, then it is a severely biased random walk tailored to the kind of order that we later go on to see with stars and planets and life. The universe was expanding for at least several billion years before the kind of order that can facilitate life clustered together. It's not random. It's not an accident. Even those several billion years, which is what the atheists like to tell you is a perfectly naturalistic explanation, it's astronomically dwarfed and washed out by the staggeringly complex permutations of combinatorial search space in which we find those ordered mathematical configurations like stars, planets, and life. Combinatorial space is the level at which something is computationally complex. And amongst the class of every cosmic possibility, the overwhelming number of configurations in the cosmos tends to more disorder than order. That is the laws, but inside that class, in that mathematical engine, the complex ordered configurations of life have a representation of the search space that is very, very, very negligible. 1 in 10 to the power of many, 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 many trillions. So God, that's number 2. God's genius, his handiwork, is evident in the mathematical engine of the universe. And I think on this point, just a word about the Big Bang itself. I mean, the cosmic story is stunning, but it presents us with a philosophical problem because it's astronomically different from the mode of discourse that we use to describe reality in scientific terms. Although science enables us to probe the cosmic origins and has helped us to discover that the universe occurred via a Big Bang, there's simply nothing in scientific reality through the scientific lens that can account for how remarkable the Big Bang is in terms of what I just described. Superficially, we can say that we've learned that the universe was set up with a Big Bang that could expand, and that whereby matter dilutes to create the right kind of temperature and density for the extraordinary story that would follow. And that's all very interesting physics. But there's nothing in science that comes close to capturing the first 2 things we've just mentioned. And don't misunderstand me, this is not a God of the gaps kind of way of arguing that because we don't understand what came before the Big Bang, not that there was really before, but we have no choice but to declare it as a miracle. That's not what we're saying. But those 2 things, combined with the fact that literally every single thing that exists and has existed in our universe was once compressed into a singularity the size of a pinprick and smaller, and that the laws of physics have been so heavily constrained by the mathematical constraints within that blueprint is the second reason why we know that God exists. And not only that, but it is absurdly weak when we try, or when anybody tries to counter that argument with something naturalistic. It doesn't work, and it doesn't do the conversation justice or the complexity of the mathematics justice. Having got this far, my number 3 reason is it's discussing supernaturalism from an epistemological perspective. And I want to say that with a caveat. You know, people are only likely to believe that miracles happen if they believe in the supernatural. You know, rather like they're only likely to believe that a ring will sparkle if it's made of real diamonds. Those who think everything is merely natural won't believe miracles happen because they don't believe in the supernatural. But I think to discuss the miraculous, we need to understand that everything created is miraculous. If God created everything, then those terms are difficult at best. There's some utility in miracles in terms of things like the scriptural evidence that miracles happened and that God intervenes and stuff like that. But technically, we need to understand that everything created is, in that sense, miraculous, by which we mean it's not natural. Because the fact that there's a God who created our universe means that the term natural, in the sense that skeptics might use it, it doesn't really have any validity in this context. So I think we should use the term supernatural to mean a created world above or beyond the natural definition. But after points 1 and 2, point 3 on the evidence that supernatural reality exists is kind of an argument along these lines. Imagine 2 alternative realities for a second. A reality in which the supernatural does not exist, we'll call that reality 1, and a reality in which the supernatural does exist, and call that reality 2. So think what it would be like to live in each of these 2 realities, and then think what it's like to live in the reality of today. So we call that reality now. So we've got 3 realities. Reality 1, the supernatural does not exist. Reality 2, the supernatural exists. Reality now is the reality today we know. What we're asking is, which reality now, or which of the first 2 realities is reality now? And what we know of today's reality now, is that a huge proportion of all the people who've ever lived believe the supernatural does exist. Now, that's actually a way more complex consideration and a more profound consideration than you might like to think. The world is full of claims of supernatural experiences, as we've labeled it in the first instance. So miracles, healings, communications with God, answers to prayer, ghosts, prognostications, that sort of thing. And countless other testimonies where people report a relationship with God as evidence that goes beyond natural explanation, as they think. So now, not all these claims are credible, obviously, but whichever way we cut the cloth, human history is absolutely replete with belief in the supernatural. And people really believe this stuff in a way that radically changes their life like nothing else in creation. a method through my sort of economist lens would be to imagine what a reality 1 and a reality 2 would be like if it did exist, and see which reality seems most like reality now. So what would reality 1 look like if this stuff exists? A world in which the imagine a world in which the supernatural does not exist. I don't believe that it would look anything like the reality now in which we live. If there was no such thing as a supernatural, I feel pretty certain that we would not live in a world like we do now, where claims of supernatural experience and insight have been so prominent throughout history that they have this kind of overwhelming impact on our lives as a whole. If reality 1 is the real reality, then it's not evident to me at all that the concept of the supernatural would have been invented at all. And here's why I think that. I don't know of any other type of human invention that creates a metaphysical reality that isn't true and then confuses the invention with actual reality. It's true that humans are immensely creative with the truth when it comes to art and literature and poetry and film and stuff, but no one is confusing that reality, and no one is confusing the reality embedded in those disciplines with an actual reality they think exists but doesn't really. You need to think about that for a moment, because it's also true that people can get confused a lot about empirical matters, especially in politics and economics. But we can't count that as being anything like the same thing here, because it merely creates a kind of metaphysical reality that isn't true and then confuses the invention with actual reality. These type of errors, they're actually cases of poor reasoning, being unapprised of facts, and they're easily corrected with fewer emotional biases and with better arguments and improved reasoning. What would reality 2 look like if reality 2 did exist? A world in which the supernatural does exist. I think it would look exactly like the world in which we currently live. I've just said that we don't invent things and then confuse the invention with actual reality. And I don't see why we would have done that with the supernatural. I think the world of the supernatural would look exactly like the world that we live in now. I think it's only by virtue of the supernatural existing that we would have such a world in which the supernatural is so prominent. We simply do not make up a new reality that prominent, that influential, and that life-changing, and confuse it with the truth. This is not the same line of argument as to say, well, there's lots of claims of supernaturalism. Of course, some of them are false. So as atheists would say, well, probably they're all false. No, it's not good enough. There's nothing else in human existence that's even on the same playing field as the significance of the supernatural in our lives. So to suggest that we just invented it and it's wholly false, and that we've allowed it and given it so much influence and devoted our lives to it is just absurd. And if the supernatural is true, you'd expect it to consist of an indefinite number of human claims where a small fraction of them are based on the truth and where most of them are either flatly false or misleading distortion of the truth. That's exactly what you'd expect to find, and I think that's what we do find. As Jesus says, in the Gospel of Matthew, wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. That is what reality now is like. There are uncountable ways to be wrong and far fewer ways to be right. But like everything else, the mass falsehoods and the widespread delusions exist not because everything supernaturally claimed is false, but because almost everything is false, but because the most important things are true. I think if reality one was the real reality, then there would be no supernatural claims at all, possibly ever. It may not have ever been invented. So having got this far, it now leads to number 4, which is, if we've got to the point where we're confident God created the universe and we're confident that the supernatural isn't something we've just made up, because it's nothing like anything we've made up, and belongs in a completely different category, then we get to the point where we can ask the next and last and most vital question. Well, which kind of God should we believe in? Who has the truth? Which religious faith, if any, have the truth? And this is where I'm going to make my 4th argument, which is a broad argument because it has various subsets, and it's why I'm a Christian and why Christianity is the truth. Christianity gets everything right about everything. If you think it doesn't, then there are things about Christianity and things about everything else that you're not getting right, as far as I'm concerned. Park that for a second and we'll return to it. Having got to the point where we're confident that God created the universe, we now have to ask the question, which God created the universe? And if we're going to assume that such a God created the universe, we're going to have to assume, I think, that such a God would take an interest in his creation and make himself known. Then we can assume that one of the religions already in existence has got it right about God. And here's why I think it's Christianity. You could say all of the religions are wrong and God did create the universe, but then if he hasn't made himself known to anybody, then we're all in the same boat and it's pointless having this conversation. But I don't think that's what's happened. So to satisfy the thing I mentioned at the beginning, which is the properties of aseity, a God that has a necessary existence, whereby it would make no sense and be contradictory if that God didn't exist, it leads us, I think, to the monotheistic religions, because the polytheistic religions don't satisfy the properties of aseity. And even if you have multiple gods, there still needs to be a hierarchy where some gods must have a value higher than others, which is why actually the polytheistic religions don't make much sense and are clearly human inventions. They sort of simulate and reflect the hierarchical structures of humans and their value-laden creations in society. So of the monotheistic religions, it really only leaves 3, doesn't it? It leaves Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Well, Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism in its proper sense. because Christ came to fulfill the law. So once you take the Old and New Testaments as the Christian word of God, then the Jewish texts are not incompatible with Christianity. What's happened to Judaism subsequent obviously is, but the Jewish texts that make up the Bible are perfectly consistent with Christianity, because Christianity is presenting us with the final completed revelation of God through Christ's birth, his death, his resurrection, and the bestowing of the Holy Spirit after the ascension. So with that being the case, Islam obviously shows itself to be a completely superfluous religion, because it inadequately lives off the influence of the Bible. It contradicts it in all the key places, while claiming to be the final piece of the jigsaw. So Christianity is the only religion that has convincing claims to have the sole and exclusively true way to know God and have the truth about who God is. So Christianity stands unique in every way. It's the religion that shows us that God was prepared to come and live amongst us, to make himself known to us in the flesh, to suffer and to die. The God I think we could justifiably believe in as the God of truth is in one who was prepared to become the central part of the narrative in the creation story that he himself created. In this incarnation and this holy book, the Bible, he has given us everything we need to know who he is. So that's number 4 on top of the first 3. And once you've got to the point in points 1 and 2 where you are satisfied that God exists and has made himself known through the genius of creation, through the mathematics, then it isn't very much of a big step to say that Christianity has the best claim to be the evidence and the exhibitor of that God. It's obviously more complex than that if we keep drilling down to the more particular tenets of that. But the kind of God that's made himself known through Christ is the kind of God we could reasonably be expected to have a relationship with, given all the other things that we've talked about. And again, that doesn't mean that an unbeliever can know that Christianity is true based on that alone, but it's a great start, and it's way, way, way better than the alternative arguments. If we think about it all with enough intelligence, with enough wisdom, with enough depth of consideration, then Christianity gets everything else right about everything too, which I might develop in a minute, on how to think, on what is true, on how to behave, on how to treat each other, on what a successful society would look like. There is nothing more compelling as an argument that God created us and nature than what we see in the Christian Bible. Now, this is equally compelling, and it may not be obvious unless you drill down into the depths of it too, but the Bible itself, it's so complex and ingenious. I think we're perfectly entitled to think and believe that it could not have been written if it did not come from God. As I said, you won't be expected to fully comprehend that by just picking it up as an outsider. As soon as you start delving into it, you're likely to sense it more, but only if you seek the truth fully will you start to get to grips, I think, with this kind of truth. But if you doubt it, then I don't think you're thinking about the Bible enough regard. And of course, if you haven't really looked into it, then that's perfectly understandable. But there's no question that the Bible is the most remarkable book in the world in terms of its multi-layered connectivity and profound complexity. And whether you're a Christian or not, I can tell you with absolute certainty that if you don't try to evaluate the Bible through the starting lens of this is the most astounding book that's ever written, your interpretation of it will be grossly inadequate to the task of uncovering its deeper rewards. I suppose a good way to think of it, perhaps for the contemporary mind, is if you think about the internet, say, as a book of stunningly complex hyperlinked text, which it is, the overarching narrative, a nexus of connectivity, seems on the surface to be remarkably too complex to have been fashioned by mere human insight. But once you understand it in its entirety, it then becomes clear that it's a bottom-up approach to creation. The overarching narrative and the nexus of connectivity of the Bible are remarkably too complex to have been fashioned by mere human insight. They have a narrative and a coherence about the narrative, an interconnection, a cohesive complexity that's too complex to have been written without inspiration from God. We never could and would have created it by ourselves. The information bandwidth, if you like, of the Bible and its granular tenets that form the central narrative of the Christian love story between God and humankind, especially the prophecies about Christ's incarnation, written hundreds of years before the New Testament was even written. It's too broad and ingenious for such a tapestry of complex, consistent, internally self-referencing, integrated thoughts and ideation to have been written by mere men. You know, the fact that 66 diverse books of the Bible written over 1,500 years in different geographical places by people who mostly never met, to think that that could encapsulate the rich and diverse historical, cultural, and psychological complexity of the range that the authors and contributors made, yet also imbue that ingenious coherence of a single author and not a contrived message between writers. It's testament to its majesty. And if you add that to the first 3 points, you are talking about a very, very compelling argument for God and Christianity. The historical veracity of Christianity in the New Testament, there's something, it's like nothing else that humans have ever come up with, even close to coming up with. What happened, you know, because of Jesus and the words that Jesus spoke, because of his actions, and because of what happened to the early Christians, is unparalleled in human history and stands alone as the central pivot around which this whole story revolves. And Jesus at the time said, "My words will never pass away." And it's another prophecy that's exactly been fulfilled. They've just grown stronger and stronger. The next subset of point 4 is the personal experience and testimony of Christians. The more you experience Christians, the more evidence you'll stack up for other people's experiences of God. finding salvation and having the Holy Spirit, the ways that Jesus has changed their lives and transformed them, the answered prayers, the miraculous healings. Once you consider the accumulation of all those things, it becomes clear that Christianity is the one true faith, and that God is responding to those who believe in him in exactly the way he promised he would. Now, I know from the outside that this is one of the hardest things for unbelievers to grasp. But that's only to be expected. You know, the central proposition of Christianity, that if you believe Jesus is who he says he is, you will be saved and have the Holy Spirit. It's exactly what you see when you start to immerse yourself in the experiences and the journey of the church, but it's also exactly what you'd expect not to see if you don't believe and have yourself immersed in it and receive the Holy Spirit yourself. You will experience a miracle if you ask God to reveal himself to you, and that is the most overwhelming accumulation of testimony and evidence the world has ever seen. And don't for a second be persuaded by the skeptics' argument who say, you know, this is all delusion, it's all confirmation bias, it's wish thinking or something of that kind. You know, they're not even engaging on the first step of the first ladder, let alone the labyrinth complexity that could be engaged with, you know. Another thing to consider, not often thought about, but I've noticed it. Christianity is the only religion that has apologetics of the kind that it has, that has a deep and broad theology with tens of thousands of books arguing and justifying its existence, its utility. There's nothing else that's ever been created like that, certainly in any of the other religions. They don't even attempt to produce apologetics and argue for why their religion is true. You may think you see lots of Muslims and Jews and Hindus defending their faith, but what they're actually defending is their experiences and their perspectives of their own cultural upbringing and the way that they've been taught their beliefs. But they've not produced even the tiniest fraction of apologetics, philosophy, theology, argumentation to explain to the world why their belief system is the right one. And Christianity has produced more than you can possibly conceive. Remember that I said Christianity gets everything else right about everything too, on how to think, on what is true, on how to behave, on how to treat each other, on what makes a successful society. Well, that is truer than we can possibly hope to grasp in its fullness. But equally, it's certainly evident from everything we observe as well. And I'm not saying that I'd expect everyone who's skeptical just to get that, because, you know, you're talking about a worldview, you're talking about a complex journey. It takes a lot of time and thinking and praying and understanding to even understand the first fraction of the basics. This is God's creation story. But it is evident, if you want to seek the truth and say, I will seek the truth no matter what, and I will see where that leads me with a sense of adventure and purpose, then if you think of any subject any psychological state of being, any wisdom on relationships, on sex, on marriage, on the family unit, on raising children, any societal or political issue, you name it. And it's not only clear of the benefit and utility of the Christian instruction on it, but it's equally evident by the lack of benefit and the lack of utility when the Christian template is ignored or compromised. God has done what he said he'd do. He's shown us the genius of his hand in creation. He's made himself personally known to all creation, and he's given us a personal relationship and a personal revelation when we've asked for one, and he's showed us his power through millions of miracles, through healings, answered prayers, and he's given us a holy book that fulfills all its promises and speaks the truth about every subject it covers, and proves itself to be right about every bit of guidance, instruction, and template for a blessed life and a successful society, should those instructions be followed. They are 4 absolutely compelling reasons, in my view, for how we know and can discover that God exists, that he is the creator of the universe, and that he has made himself known in Christ. And there are many, many more reasons why we should believe too, but that's a whistle-stop tour of the 4 what I think are fundamentals. And thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. Do check out my blog in the link below for much more material on this and many other subjects. And thank you for joining me. Goodbye.